For today's episode of the podcast, I'm sharing with you a sort of cautionary tale of all the things not to do when you're overexcited about casting on to a particular knitting project. And that's not just because I know better and I would never do any of the things that I'm mentioning here today. On the contrary, that's because I do know better, but I've done each of the things I'm going to mention here today. So if you'd like to dive in with me and hear about my tales of woe, grab a cup of something cozy and let's dive in. Hello, and welcome to the Wool Needles Hands Knitting Podcast. My name is Taylor, and I will be your host. For today's episode of the podcast, I have a sort of tale of woe for you. I am going to be talking about just one project today, because the project that I'm sharing with you has given me so much grief over the course of the last week that I've actually gotten so little knitting done in general, because I feel like the wind has been taken out of my sails because of this one particular project. And actually, there's a little bit more to it than that, but it's significant enough to just put a little bit of a damper on my knitting mojo in general. It's not gone. I definitely still have my knitting mojo, and I feel like that's part of why I want to address this issue with you guys today, because I have the hankering to get to knitting and just start working on my projects. But there's some things I can't get beyond, a project I'm not going to be able to move on with. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that in a minute, and just some other concerns that I'm having about a particular style of knitting that I am doing right now for the first time. But before I get into any of that, I want to give you a quick announcement. Now, as many of you know, I am a huge fan of Lovely Valley wool. I have cones and skeins in my own personal stash. I'm crazy about this yarn for several reasons. One of those reasons being that this is beautiful merino rambouillet that is born and shorn in my home state of Nevada. And I had the pleasure of meeting with Megan, who is the owner of Lovely Valley Wool, as well as her family at the Dufferina Sheep Company Ranch up in northern Nevada. And I absolutely fell in love with the ranch and the people. And from that initial meetup and interaction, we developed a little bit of a collaboration between the two of us. And I, as the owner and dyer of Fiber for the People, will be sourcing my yarn from Megan of Lovely Valley Wool, offering a really fantastic collection of Fiber for the People yarn that is born, shorn, and dyed in my home state of Nevada, and I am so excited about that. Now, the first shop update for this particular line of yarn is going to be this Saturday, October 7th at 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time, so you definitely want to check that out. I just did a little bit of an unboxing of my first big batch of undyed Lovely Valley wool, and I shared that over on the Wool Needles Hands Patreon. If you would like to watch that, as well as other bonus content available over there, definitely consider being a member of Patreon. It is a fantastic way to support the work that I'm doing here at the Wool Needles Hands channel. Should you decide to head over to Patreon to become a member, thank you from the bottom of my heart for helping keep the lights on for the long haul here at the Wool Needles Hands channel. Now, listen, I can talk a big game when it comes to what to do and what not to do in terms of your knitting projects. And I really do know what you should do and what you should not do when it comes to approaching new cast-ons or new knitting projects. However, I am human, and I am definitely liable to give in to hasty cast-ons. And the project I'm going to be talking about today is exactly one of those. I was excited about something I saw on another person's podcast, thought that I had the yarn to suit the project, and threw all caution to the wind and cast it on a whim completely. I hope that you can take away some valuable information and experience from my experience and maybe avoid the same problem in the future. Now, I really want to preface this by telling you that in no way are my complaints here today about the pattern or the designer. So I am really owning up to the fact that the problems I'm having are absolutely user error, and also just part of me not taking into consideration things I really should have taken into consideration before starting the project. Now, all of this is probably annoyingly cryptic, so let's go ahead and get right into it. The project in question is my Stripe Hype sweater by Veronica Lindberg of Kutovakia. I think that's how you say it, but it's Veronica Lindberg. This is a really lovely sweater pattern. I think the stripes are a lot of fun. I think the construction of the sweater is very wearable. It has a really nice kind of drop shoulder look, which is constructed seamlessly using a lot of picking up of stitches, which is called, wait for it folks, we can all revel in this together, contiguous knitting. Now I really have to do a little sidebar here to just apologize for my egregious pronunciation of the word contiguous on like a few episodes of the podcast ago.
She comes before you with a solemn heart to make her walk of atonement.
I don't really know how to explain what happened there. I find myself to be a pretty well-spoken individual with an above average vocabulary. But here's the thing. The word contiguous is one I have only ever heard, and I don't think I have ever read it before. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know what I would be reading where that word is being used often, but I do know that I hear the word used a lot. You hear it especially when referring to like election season or geographical locations, things like that, especially the contiguous United States, which is a very familiar phrase to me. But when I read this word within the context of knitting, I did not put those two things together in terms of something that shares like a common border with something else. That didn't come into my mind contextually speaking. So I started to say the word contiguous. I don't even know, how did I say it? Contiguous? Contiguous? I can't remember how I said it, but it was so wrong. And I have no real good excuse other than the one that I just said. And I remember after uploading that podcast or actually editing the pod. No, it wasn't even when I was editing. I would have said something. I would have put some text on the screen. It was after it had uploaded and I was watching it with my husband. And I was thinking like, that isn't right. That's wrong. And he's like, yeah, it's contiguous, like the contiguous United States. It was just such a facepalm moment for me. So I added immediately in the description box and that pinned comment below the video, like I'm realizing what's happened here. I'm saying this word incorrectly. So long story short, I am aware of that absolute just horrific pronunciation of what should be a pretty, recognized word. And odd, when it comes to like words I have heard, I do recognize it. But when it comes to words I have read, and especially within the context of knitting, I just said whatever. I don't know, guys. Okay, so anyway, I know I was saying it incorrectly. It is absolutely unnecessary moving forward to make me aware. I know. And I know that that's not going to end the comments that come in telling me how much I have, committed sin against the world of linguistics and pronunciation. Like, I get it. Just so you know, I know that it is contiguous, like the contiguous United States. We are going to move on now and talk about this project, which happens to be knit contiguously. The Stripe Hype sweater by Veronica Lindberg is knit contiguously, resulting in what looks to be a garment knit in pieces. However, there are no seams to seam up at the very end. Everything eventually just connects to everything else. Like the word would suggest, sharing a common border, you're picking up stitches, you're not sewing things closed at the seams. Now, this is a new style of knitting or construction of knitting for me. I am doing this on another sweater that we're not talking about today because we're trying to stick to this one sweater today. But my sweater number 18 by My Favorite Things Knitwear is moving along swimmingly. However, some of the things that I learned through this, I'm taking into consideration with that particular sweater. However, because of the textured nature of that sweater and the yarn that I'm using, the issues I'm running into here are not really issues for that sweater, so it's fine. But what's happening here? A few different things are happening here, and I want to take this one step at a time as I lay out for you how I pretty much did everything wrong when it came to casting on and just approaching this project in general. So I'm going to hold this up. Now, please bear in mind, this is a drop shoulder construction. So when this is around my neck, these portions of the shoulder are supposed to drop down my shoulders a little bit. Okay, and then here's the body of the sweater. I apologize, my needles are going to be jangling all over the place. Okay, so just here it is. I have blocked this because there were some issues I was seeing. I was trying to determine if they would block out in the end. And so I blocked this to kind of get an idea of what it was going to look like after it was all blocked. So here it is. I would say that the shoulders start to bend down about here. Okay. Now, that's what it looks like. Let's start with the preparations for this project. The project calls for a DK weight yarn. I'm fairly certain. Let's double check, because that was definitely a concern when I started this project, was whether or not I had enough DK weight yarn to handle the project. And I didn't, as far as I remember. And so I improvised. Suggested yarn, DK weight yarn. Yes. Okay. The project calls for a DK weight yarn. I didn't have a DK weight yarn. I had, in the quantities of the colors that I would want to put into stripes, I had worsted weight yarn. And not just any worsted weight yarn, 2 different kinds or brands of worsted weight yarn. I have Patons Classic Wool Worsted, which is what you see right here. Fantastic budget, 100% untreated wool yarn, and Lion brand Fisherman's Wool, which you know how much I love this. This is also considered a worsted weight yarn. I had these in my stash. I loved the way that they looked together, and I thought that they would make a fantastic stripe hype sweater. And I thought to myself, you know what? I'm just gonna go ahead and do it with this yarn. I'll use a needle size that's appropriate. My gauge swatch was actually with just a single strand of the Patons Classic Wool, and you can't even call it a gauge swatch. I think I knit a little rounded, like a gauge swatch in the round for maybe like an inch depth, and then looked at it to see, and I just went ahead with it because it seemed to be okay, to like, it seemed to be where if I just sized down, because my stitch gauge, because I didn't count my row gauge, because that's not something I typically do, which is another issue altogether. But my stitch gauge was close enough that if I just went down a size, it probably would be okay. Now, a big part of all of this, when it came to planning this project and thinking it through and really just wanting to get to the project, a lot of it's probably going to be okay was going on in my head. First red flag about a knitting project is if you're telling yourself it's probably going to be okay. Because yes, it probably will be okay, but it also probably will not be okay. And I know that that may be kind of a pessimistic way to look at it, but all I'm saying is that if you even find yourself having to say these things like probably be okay, you didn't take enough time to consider the project, and you didn't put enough time into ensuring, the highest chances of success, right? And I did not. I just wanted to get busy with the project, and that is a problem. Hasty cast-ons when it's a garment, like like a sweater you're going to wear on your body, especially when the construction style of the sweater is new to you. Hasty cast-ons and all of that enthusiasm or unbridled enthusiasm is not a good combination. You need to go at it with intention. You need to read through the pattern. You need to think about what you're reading and what that means for how you're going to complete the project. And I'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So the first thing that I did wrong was I did a lousy gauge swatch with only one of the yarns, considering that they are different brands of yarn and they are, slightly different thicknesses. If we're talking about like, the actual strand of yarn itself, I just kind of willy-nilly decided to go down a size when I probably should have gone down 2 sizes, and that's just part of the gauge issue, and I'll talk about that too. And then not reading through the pattern to consider this new type of contiguous construction. Now, let's talk first, before I get into the construction issues, let's talk first about the size. This isn't going to take very long, guys. This is enormous. I tried it on today after blocking it. It blocked out far larger than I was expecting it to. I mean, I think you can see my body and you can see the sweater. Like that's well over 12 inches of ease in my bust. And I feel like 12 inches is on the high end of how much ease you should have on a sweater that's supposed to have an oversized fit. In my particular opinion, I think anything over 12 inches, you've now gone from oversized to just, it doesn't fit you and you need to find something else. And this is well over that. And that's because when you measure my gauge, now that it has been blocked, when I measured my gauge, number one, on the gold mustard color yarn here, it was way off. And especially on this oatmeal color here, it was also way off on the large side, meaning that the gauge I was getting, like I would have needed to go down 2 needle sizes and I didn't. And so this is a huge problem. Pun intended. I mean, it's not really a huge problem. It's a lesson I'm learning, right? I could be like hyperbolic about this and I shouldn't be. Big mistake gauge wise. This garment is just much too big. My own fault, and I own it completely. Take the time to check the gauge appropriately. If for you that doesn't mean knitting out an entire gauge swatch and washing it and pinning it down and making sure it's perfect, I don't know if that's exactly what that means, but it definitely means do more than some shoddy 1-inch deep strip of fabric in only one of the yarns and in only one form of knitting when the project actually asks you to knit both circularly and flat. Like, take a little bit more time, especially if the yarn you're using is not even the same weight as what's recommended in the pattern. I don't really know why I felt so compelled. Like, this is a cute sweater, don't get me wrong, but it's not like the cutest sweater I've ever seen. And I mean, that sounds way worse. It's not that kind of a sweater that causes you to just throw all caution to the wind and cast on in reckless abandon. Nothing matters. Size doesn't matter. I will knit this sweater at all costs or without consideration of the important things that's really going to help drive my success in this project. You know, it's not that. I've seen sweaters that have excited me more than this one, and I really think this is a great sweater. But yeah, so I'm so annoyed about this whole thing because this is a lot of work, right? That's a lot of work. And I could really beat myself up about it and think it's just a bunch of wasted time. Look at, what are you going to do? You can't get those hours back. And I don't think like that. Like, I have learned a lesson. And this is a lesson I should have learned a long time ago. I mean, I'm a relatively experienced knitter. But yeah, no, this is a learning experience. And so I will allow it to be that for me, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating. The next thing. Now, okay, because this is knit contiguously, meaning you are going to be picking up stitches and creating new portions of the sweater as you go, as opposed to knitting it in the round from the top down. You knit a portion of the sweater flat, and then once you get down, so this is all of this up here is knit flat, and then once you get down below the armholes and you combine the front and the back, you begin knitting in the round. Well, anybody who's been knitting for any length of time and has knit both flat and in the round probably has become aware of the fact that your gauge flat and your gauge in the round is different. For some of us, and how it's different varies for everybody. I think that's what I would have tried to say there. It's not always different in the same ways, but most often it's different. And that means that if you're knitting something flat and then suddenly changing from knitting flat to knitting in the round, meaning you're no longer purling, in most cases with stockinette stitch, you're gonna notice an abrupt change if you don't make some adjustments to either your actual tension, the size of your needle, the way that you're wrapping your stitches to execute your purl stitches on the side that you're purling on. If you don't take into consideration these adjustments, you're going to notice a pretty big difference in your fabric from where you were knitting flat to where you connected to knit in the round. And that is exactly what happened to me here. And in fact, before I even got to the portion of the sweater where I was going to combine and begin knitting in the round, I started thinking about this. I was thinking about how I have heard people say that if you go from knitting your body of your sweater in the round, and then you go to knit your sleeves in the round. On your sleeves, because it's a smaller circumference, you should consider sizing up, because that smaller circumference can lend itself to a tighter fabric, whatever. So these are all little things and ideas that had been planted in my head and things that I was considering, but I didn't give it enough time. I didn't ask the questions ahead of time. I had knit almost the entire yoke of the sweater before really pondering what this meant for my project moving forward after I combine or connect everything to knit it in the round for the rest of the body. And so what I ended up with, and I talk about this a little bit on the previous episode where I share this project, is I ended up with a fabric up here that was just kind of open and gappy. The row gauge for the oatmeal colored yarn was significantly greater than that of the mustard yarn. Things just weren't very even, and that's because my purls are much more open and require much more yarn generally than my knits. And when I knit back and forth between knitting and purling, it's just not as even as it is when I'm just knitting all the way around. There's tension variations between my knits and my purls that just cause this really interesting uneven texture. And you may be able to see a little bit of that here. So here on this part of the fabric, you're going to notice that there's some like gappiness going on in those stitches. They're kind of open and they're a little uneven. But then, and I did not knit very much of the body in the round before kind of coming to all of this realization. You might be able to notice a significantly more even kind of tension right in this area as opposed to what's happening down here. And that's because all of this was knit stockinette in the round. And then everything below that was knit stockinette flat with a whole side of purls. Now, this is frustrating for me because had I taken the time to consider this, had I read through the pattern ahead of time, realizing I'm going to be knitting flat and then I'm going to be knitting in the round, had I made those considerations, I might have thought, I need to consider my needle sizes here. I need to do a gauge swatch flat, and I need to do a gauge swatch in the round, and I need to see exactly how different these two things are. And then I need to decide, am I going to use a smaller needle size when I get to knitting in the round? Am I going to adjust my actual tension? Am I going to look for another technique for purling that allows it to be a little bit more even or consistent with the knit stitch? What am I going to do to ensure that my fabric doesn't look different on the yoke as it's going to look on the rest of the body? And then also how to make sure that my whole sleeve is not considerably knit to a considerably tighter gauge than the rest of my body. These are all things I really should have considered ahead of time, and I didn't. And there's a small part of me, and again, I am not placing any of this in the lap of the designer. I'm not that person. I'm really not. But when all of this was happening, I was very frustrated. And I remember thinking, like, it would have been nice if it had said in the pattern, just so you know, chances are your gauge is not going to be the same when you're knitting the yoke flat to when you combine to knit in the round. So take that into consideration. Even if it had just said, just here's this, take it into consideration, to alert my brain to pay more attention to that. I don't think this designer needs to go add that. I don't think any designer needs to go add that. It is up to them what they do. Frustrated me, who was just thinking out of pure frustration, like, well, this wouldn't have happened if I knew better. So yeah, I mean, like, it would be nice if there was mention of that, but that's not something to expect, nor is that something that I expect in the future. It's something that I know now from my own experience, and honestly, that's the best way to learn something. So if you plan on knitting a design where you're going to be doing this contiguous construction, where you're knitting things flat and then picking up stitches and then combining them to knit in the round, you have a lot of things to consider, and don't and take those things seriously, because you might notice differences in your fabric that once you get to a certain point, you realize you just don't like it. It just doesn't look great. And then you become disappointed. And had you taken these things into consideration, you may not have had these issues. Now, from what I gather, this phenomenon that happens when you notice your row and stitch gauge and kind of like your wonky tension varying from flat to knitting in the round, apparently this is called rowing out. And I had never heard that phrase before. ever in my life. But when I started talking about this for the first time, the beautiful people in this community here at the Wool Needles Hands YouTube channel, they came they came in clutch in the comment section under that video telling me like, this is what's happening. This is a really great way to avoid this happening. And it was phenomenal reading all of the suggestions in the comments of that video, because they were telling me this is what's going on. This is, really common. It's happened to me before. These are some things that you can do to prevent that from happening, encouraging me to avoid waiting for blocking to see if it blocks out, to go back and fix some things, because I'll be happy about it I'll be happier if I just fix things that are bugging me. All kinds of really fantastic advice. And I will link to the video I'm talking about in the description box here, so that if you would like to go see the comment section over there, there's so much great insight. But I learned about rowing out. And that is just where, when you are knitting on one side and purling on the other side of stockinette fabric, you're going to have inconsistencies in your stitches row gauge, and then also the stitch gauge. So that one row, the row that you do your knit stitches on, looks different than the row below it or above it where you're doing your purls. You're going to notice an inconsistency between those two rows, which almost gives the fabric this like strange textural striping effect. And that is absolutely what I see here on this. And you may not be able to notice it as much as I notice it, just because it's kind of an issue I'm kind of obsessing over, but I really see it a lot right here. You can see these little micro stripes of texture happening, and there are some places where it's really noticeable. In fact, when I finally decided to change my needle size to accommodate for this phenomenon, if you will, there was a huge stripe of bulging stitches. I'm trying to look to see. Yeah, right here. You can see it going all the way across. It's a big stripe of bulging stitches from the needle size changing. And I will admit, blocking helped a little. Before I blocked, it was so noticeable and so aggravating, because I could feel it. I could tell just by the way it felt. And I'm going to show you the reverse side, because that's where it really stands out. I could tell that it probably wasn't going to block out completely. My microphone is right in front of me. That's why whenever I do this, it's always super awkward. So I don't know if you can see. Do you see this like gully in my stitches right here? Let's see. Right there. Sorry, I'm flipping everybody off unintentionally, but there's this like gap, or kind of like a trench, a trench right here in my stitches. And that is where I had this like rowing out experience, where the needle was changing from like a smaller needle to a larger needle, and that adjustment in stitch gauge was so pronounced that it created this gap in my stitches. When I say it's so unsightly when you are the one doing this project and you're putting time into it, and you know it's going to bother you, and especially when you know it could have been avoided had you taken some time, maybe ask some questions before starting the project, all of these things. And so what I would do differently next time, and honestly, there's so many things I would do differently on this project, because I really do want to knit this project. The first thing I would do to mitigate the gauge issues up front is I would not choose two different yarns for this, meaning I wouldn't choose two different brands of yarn. I would stick to one particular type of yarn if I wanted to do the stripes in two different colors, or however many different colors, but I would not mix brands of yarn, because I can't guarantee, I mean, they might be in the same weight category as being worsted, but I can't guarantee that they are the same, because it's going to show on a project like this. It's all stockinette stitch. You're going to see any kind of slight variation, especially because you're already dealing with the gauge potentially changing from when you're knitting it flat to when you're knitting it in the round. So the first thing I would do differently is choose two of the same yarn. Second thing I would do differently here is I would knit two complete gauge swatches in the stripe pattern, in the round and flat, and both on the same needle size. And then I would compare the difference in gauge. Whatever the difference is in gauge, I would adjust the needle for each of the different sections that are either knit flat or knit in the round. Somebody also, no, not somebody, several people also suggested that when you're knitting flat, instead of wrapping your yarn around your needle when you're purling over the top of the needle, wrapping it under the needle and over uses less yarn when you purl and can actually help to even out the tension of the purl stitch so that it's more consistent with the knit stitch. So perhaps maybe when I gauge swatch, I would just kind of adopt that method of purling and see how that serves me in terms of tension. So that would be something else. And then, yeah, and then I would choose my needle sizes accordingly and be aware. I would just know going into it what is potentially going to happen, what kinds of issues I might see, how different those two gauge swatches were, what that means for my project. And I think just being that much more prepared up front for a project like this, that's what would ultimately lead me to, much more success than I'm having here. And not to mention the fact that the size is off. And I didn't even mention that either in the beginning, but I would also use yarn in the appropriate size. Okay. Now that's not saying that you can't knit a project in a different weight of yarn than what's called for. You absolutely can. And there's ways that you can adjust your gauge to meet the criteria of the project. This is definitely something you can do. But in the case of what I'm doing here and the approach that, my approach to this project, all things considered, that was just really not a great idea. So I would definitely change that. Now, am I going to do this again? And when? And I don't know, what's the deal? What's the status? Well, right now, this is what I have. It's too big. I'm part of me is, it's not going to fit my husband. There's no way this would fit my husband. I haven't tried it on him. This right here is a little snug to fit around my head. It fits beautifully around my neck, but it goes around my head, it's a little snug. So I think it would be too small for my husband. And I honestly don't think the sweater is that big that it would really fit my husband. So I don't know what I'm going to do with this. I think the colors are fine, but this is another thing that's maybe bringing me a little bit of comfort here. Is that now that I've seen it blocked and I've held it up to my face, I actually don't know how much I love these colors together next to my face. I think that this color by itself is lovely. I feel like this would be really pretty all by itself in a lovely sweater. I even think that this color all by itself, although I feel like this could tend to wash me out a little bit more, I don't think that it's unappealing. I like this color, against my skin. But the two of them together, that, for whatever reason, I might be wrong, but there's something about it that washes me out. And maybe it's just like psychologically, it's like I'm trying to find ways to make myself feel better about, scrapping this project. But I don't know, like I kind of look at this and I wish it were one or the other, right? Like I wish it were all this mustard color or all this oatmeal color, because the two colors together, like, I don't know. So yeah. Okay, so, and then these armholes, like those just look too deep. Everything about it. It's just, I did everything wrong, you guys. I'm sorry. I feel compelled to apologize. And the reason why, is because I should know better. I really, really should know better. So take from this what you will, but definitely take from this the knowledge that we all do this. And there's going to be times when you kind of spontaneously and frivolously cast something on without thinking about it, and then it comes back to bite you in the butt. Or most of the time you might get lucky and you'll never have that problem, which will only continue to perpetuate the likelihood of this, happening to you. However, you can learn from my experience, like live vicariously through me here, and take the time to do things properly. Measure twice, cut once. That's kind of what's happening here, is I didn't even measure and I used the, incorrect materials in, to a point. And I didn't consider, the speed bumps that were inevitably going to get in my way, considering the fact that it's new construction to me, I guess you could say, with the contiguous knitting construction. So that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. I really wanted to just kind of focus in on this one particular project. I don't know if I'm going to cast on another stripe hype sweater anytime soon. I am working on sweater number 18. I have my Un sweater that I'm also working on right now. You can go back a couple episodes, the one that I linked to down below in the description box if you want to kind of see more about that. I'm loving my sweater number 18. My own sweater, I'm a little concerned that the neck is going to be too wide, but that's a tale for another day. So I'm just going to focus on those things. I cast it onto a pair of Sunday socks just recently. I share that whole cast on party process over on the Patreon. And so I'll be talking more about those in the next podcast. But right now, I just really wanted to get this off my chest. So I hope that you were able to take something away from that. I appreciate you for being here. I appreciate you for being here to watch, to comment, to give me a like when you feel so compelled, but to just be here listening to me ramble about these things. It really means so much to me. You make all the difference, and I thank you so much for that. If you took anything away from today's video, definitely don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe, and click that bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload new content on the channel. And if you would like to further support the work that I'm doing here at the Wool Needles Hands channel, consider becoming a Patreon member, where you can enjoy special bonus features and extra benefits that members enjoy. All of this makes such a difference. Thank you so much. You guys truly are what make this go round. Until I see you again for Wednesday's episode of the Midweek Ramble, happy knitting, happy making, happy whatever it is that you're doing. Take care, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye.